The cafeteria erupted in cruel laughter as mashed potatoes splattered across Marcus Thompson's worn jacket, followed by chunks of mystery meat and chocolate milk that dripped down his glasses. What those bullies didn't know was that the quiet kid they'd been tormenting for months had just inherited something that would make them rue the day they ever laid eyes on him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By the end of the week, those same bullies would be on their knees, begging for mercy from the boy they thought was powerless. Marcus Thompson sat alone at the corner table of Lincoln High School's crowded cafeteria, methodically eating his peanut butter sandwich while reading a dog-eared paperback novel. At 17, he had perfected the art of invisibility, keeping his head down and avoiding eye contact with the clusters of students who ruled the social hierarchy of their suburban high school. His thick-rimmed glasses, hand-me-down clothes, and quiet demeanor made him an easy target in a school where image was everything and conformity was king. What his classmates saw was a skinny kid with messy brown hair who lived in the same faded jeans and oversized hoodies, someone who walked the halls with his shoulders hunched and never spoke unless directly addressed by a teacher. They saw someone weak, vulnerable, and completely disconnected from the wealth and privilege that defined most of Lincoln High's student body. What they didn't see was the sharp intelligence behind those wire-rimmed glasses, the careful observation skills he'd developed from years of staying in the shadows, or the burning determination that kept him focused on his goals despite their constant harassment. Marcus lived with his grandmother, Eleanor Thompson, in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of town. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 12, leaving him in the care of his father's mother, a retired librarian who survived on Social Security and her late husband's modest pension. Eleanor had raised Marcus with love and wisdom, teaching him the value of education, patience, and perseverance in the face of adversity. She often reminded him that their circumstances were temporary, but his character would last forever. The apartment was small, but immaculately clean, filled with books and the smell of Eleanor's homemade cookies. Marcus had converted the tiny den into his study space, where he spent hours each night working on homework, reading ahead in his textbooks, and researching colleges that offered full scholarships to students with exceptional academic records. His grades were flawless, his test scores in the 99th percentile, and his teachers consistently praised his work ethic and intellectual curiosity. What Marcus kept secret from everyone, including his grandmother, was his other passion. In the privacy of his bedroom, he spent countless hours studying something that had nothing to do with traditional academics. Hidden beneath his bed was a collection of books, manuals, and printed articles about psychology, social dynamics, influence, and what some might call the darker arts of human manipulation. Marcus had taught himself to understand people in ways that went far beyond normal social interaction. His interest had begun innocently enough, sparked by his desire to understand why some people seemed to effortlessly command respect and attention while others, like himself, remained invisible. But as the bullying at school intensified, his studies had taken on a more focused purpose. He learned about psychological pressure points, social leverage, reputation management, and the subtle ways that information could be weaponized. He studied case studies of corporate espionage, political manipulation, and social engineering with the same intensity that other students devoted to sports or video games. Marcus had also developed an unexpected talent for technology that went far beyond the basic computer skills taught in his programming classes. Using library computers and free Wi-Fi from local businesses, he had taught himself advanced hacking techniques, social media manipulation, digital forensics, and online investigation methods. He could trace IP addresses, recover deleted files, access private social media accounts, and create anonymous online identities that were virtually impossible to track. The combination of psychological insight and technical skill had given Marcus a unique ability to gather information about people, understand their weaknesses and fears, and, if necessary, apply pressure in ways that were both subtle and devastating. He'd never used these skills maliciously, viewing them more as intellectual exercises and tools for self-protection. But he'd also never been pushed to his absolute breaking point by people who seemed determined to make his life miserable. Lincoln. High school was located in an affluent suburb where most families lived in large houses with perfectly manicured lawns and multiple luxury cars in their driveways. The student body was dominated by the children of successful professionals, business owners, and inherited wealth. These students wore designer clothes, carried the latest smartphones, and planned their weekends around expensive activities that Marcus could never afford to join. The school itself reflected this affluence, with state-of-the-art facilities, advanced technology in every classroom, and extracurricular programs that rivaled those of many colleges. The football team practiced on a field with professional grade, artificial turf. The arts program had equipment that most universities would envy, and the college counseling office was staffed with former admissions officers from prestigious institutions. Within this environment of privilege and opportunity, certain students had learned that their family connections and social status provided them with significant protection from consequences. They operated under an unspoken understanding that their parents' donations to the school, their involvement in community organizations, and their social connections created a shield that allowed them to push boundaries that other students couldn't cross. The undisputed leader of Lincoln High's social hierarchy was Jake Sullivan, an 18-year-old senior who stood 6 feet tall with the confident posture of someone who'd never experienced real adversity. His father owned the largest construction company in the county, building the expensive homes where most of his classmates lived. His mother served on the school board and chaired multiple charity organizations that provided her with significant social influence throughout the community. Jake had inherited his father's commanding presence and his mother's social intelligence, making him naturally charismatic in ways that attracted followers and intimidated potential opponents. He was handsome in a conventional way, with blonde hair that he kept perfectly styled, blue eyes that could shift from charming to cold depending on his mood, and the kind of easy smile that made adults trust him immediately while hiding his true nature from authority figures. As the starting quarterback for Lincoln High's championship football team, Jake enjoyed hero status that extended far beyond the school grounds. Local newspapers featured him regularly, college recruiters visited their home, and community members recognized him wherever he went. This combination of athletic success, family wealth, and social connections had created an environment where Jake rarely heard the word no and never faced serious consequences for his actions. Jake's inner circle consisted of 3 other seniors who had been his closest friends since elementary school. Each brought something valuable to their group dynamic while sharing Jake's sense of entitlement and casual cruelty towards students. They considered beneath their notice. Ryan Martinez served as Jake's closest advisor and strategic planner. The son of a successful attorney, Ryan had inherited his father's analytical mind and his ability to find loopholes in rules and systems. Ryan was shorter than Jake, with dark hair and intense brown eyes that seemed to constantly evaluate people and situations for potential advantages. He was the one who planned their harassment campaigns with methodical precision, ensuring that their actions stayed just within the boundaries of what they could defend if questioned by authority figures. Ryan's father, David Martinez, was one of the most respected lawyers in the county, known for his ability to get wealthy clients out of legal trouble through technical arguments and procedural challenges. Ryan had learned from observing his father that rules were suggestions for people with sufficient resources and intelligence to circumvent them. He applied this philosophy to his high school social life, viewing other students as either useful, allies, or acceptable targets for entertainment. The third member of their group was Connor Williams, whose family had moved to the area 5 years earlier when his father accepted a position as the regional vice president for a major pharmaceutical company. Connor was tall and lean with red hair and freckles that made him look younger than his 18 years, but his easygoing personality and genuine sense of humor had quickly earned him acceptance into Jake's exclusive circle. Connor's role in the group was to provide plausible deniability and social cover for their more questionable activities. His natural likability and reputation as a good-natured jokester meant that when teachers or administrators questioned their behavior, Connor could often diffuse situations by presenting their actions as harmless pranks that had been misunderstood. His father's corporate position also provided the family with significant financial resources and community connections that enhanced their social protection. The fourth member of their inner circle was Derek Chang, the son of two successful doctors who had high expectations for their only child's academic and social achievements. Derek was academically gifted, ranking third in their graduating class, but he'd chosen to align himself with Jake's group rather than focus exclusively on his studies. Derek was of medium height with straight black hair and the kind of intense focus that made him excellent at executing detailed plans. Derek's parents had immigrated from South Korea in the 1990s and had worked extraordinarily hard to establish their medical practices and gain acceptance in their affluent community. They viewed their son's friendship with Jake Sullivan as evidence of their successful integration into American society and encouraged the relationship despite occasionally being concerned about some of Derek's behavioral changes since joining the popular crowd. Derek's contribution to the group was his academic intelligence and his access to information through his parents' social connections. His mother served on the hospital board with several school board members, and his father played golf regularly with many of the community's business leaders. This network provided Derek with advanced knowledge of school policy changes, insight into family dynamics among the wealthy families, and occasionally access to private information that could be used for social leverage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Together, these four young men had created a systematic approach to maintaining their social dominance through a combination of charisma, strategic thinking, social connections, and, when necessary, targeted harassment of students who threatened their position or simply provided convenient targets for their entertainment. They'd perfected their methods over several years, learning to walk the line between outright bullying and behavior that could be dismissed as typical teenage social dynamics. Their campaign against Marcus Thompson had begun during the second week of the school year when he'd inadvertently drawn their attention by scoring the highest grade on a chemistry test that Derek had struggled with despite his usually effortless academic success. Derek had mentioned Marcus's perfect score during lunch, expressing frustration that some nobody scholarship kid was outperforming him in a class where he needed to maintain his high GPA for college applications. Jake had been immediately interested in this challenge to their group's assumed superiority. He'd made it his business to learn everything he could about Marcus Thompson, discovering his family background, his financial situation, his social isolation, and what appeared to be his complete vulnerability to their standard intimidation tactics. Marcus seemed like the perfect target, someone they could pressure without risk of retaliation or complications from protective parents or social connections. The harassment had started subtly, as it always did, Ryan had created fake social media accounts to send Marcus anonymous messages questioning his academic integrity and suggesting that he was receiving unfair assistance from teachers who felt sorry for his family situation. Derek had used his access to student records through his volunteer work in the guidance office to spread rumors about Marcus's financial aid status and his family's tragic history. Connor had initiated the social isolation component of their campaign by making jokes about Marcus's appearance and behavior whenever he was within earshot, encouraging other students to view him as someone who didn't fit in with Lincoln High's social environment. The jokes were carefully crafted to seem like harmless observations rather than deliberate cruelty, making it difficult for Marcus to complain without appearing oversensitive. Jake's role was to provide the physical intimidation that gave weight to the psychological pressure. He would appear in hallways where Marcus was walking, forcing him to step aside or change direction. He would stand too close during the few times Marcus was required to participate in group activities, using his larger size and confident demeanor to create an atmosphere of vague threat without technically doing anything that could be reported as harassment. The campaign had been remarkably effective in its early stages. Marcus's grades remained perfect, but his teachers noticed that he'd become even more withdrawn than usual. He stopped participating in the few extracurricular activities he'd previously enjoyed, spending his lunch periods in the library rather than the cafeteria where he might encounter Jake's group. He seemed to shrink into himself, becoming almost invisible as he moved through the school hallways. What Jake and his friends didn't realize was that Marcus was documenting everything. His background in psychology and technology had taught him the importance of evidence and pattern recognition. He kept detailed records of every incident, every message, every social slight, and every moment of intimidation. He used his technical skills to trace the anonymous social media accounts back to their sources, gathering proof of their coordinated campaign against him. More importantly, Marcus had begun his own investigation into Jake Sullivan and his inner circle. Using techniques he'd learned from his private studies, he'd started gathering information about their personal lives, their family situations, their private communications, and their activities outside of school. He'd learned to access their social media accounts, monitor their text messages, and track their digital footprints with a level of sophistication that would have impressed professional investigators. Marcus had discovered that Jake's family construction business was facing serious financial difficulties due to several lawsuits from dissatisfied customers and what appeared to be some questionable business practices involving municipal contracts. Ryan's father was dealing with a state bar investigation related to his handling of client funds. Connor's family was struggling with his father's gambling addiction, which had created significant debt and marital problems. Derek's parents were fighting constantly about his mother's affair with another doctor at the hospital. Each of these secrets was carefully documented and verified through multiple sources. Marcus had learned to corroborate information by cross-referencing public records, social media posts, overheard conversations, and digital communications. He'd built comprehensive profiles of his tormentors that revealed their vulnerabilities, their fears, and the pressure points that could be used to turn the tables on their harassment campaign. But Marcus had also been raised by his grandmother to believe in fairness, patience, and giving people opportunities to change their behavior before resorting to extreme measures. Despite having the tools and information necessary to destroy his harassers' reputations and social standing, he'd chosen to endure their campaign while hoping they would eventually grow bored and move on to other targets. The escalation had come gradually, as Jake's group grew more confident in their ability to torment Marcus without consequences. The anonymous messages became more frequent and more personal, attacking not just his academic performance, but his family situation, his appearance, and his social status. The social isolation intensified as other students learned to avoid associating with someone who was clearly marked as an outsider by the school's most popular group. The physical intimidation had also increased in frequency and boldness. Jake had started accidentally bumping into Marcus in hallways, causing him to drop his books or stumble into lockers. Connor had begun making loud comments about Marcus's clothes, his smell, and his antisocial behavior whenever they were in the same classroom or common area. Derek had spread rumors about Marcus's family history and their financial struggles, making sure the information reached students who would be most likely to repeat and embellish the stories. Ryan had orchestrated more sophisticated psychological warfare, including having other students exclude Marcus from group projects, spreading false information about his academic performance, and even manipulating teacher assignments to ensure that Marcus was frequently placed in uncomfortable social situations where his isolation would be most obvious and embarrassing. The campaign had reached a new level of cruelty 3 weeks before, the cafeteria incident. Jake's group had discovered that Marcus's grandmother was working part-time as a cleaning lady at several local businesses to supplement their income, including the office building where Connor's father worked. They'd used this information to create elaborate jokes about Marcus's servant family and their proper place in the community's social hierarchy. This attack on his grandmother had crossed a line that Marcus hadn't even realized existed. Eleanor Thompson was the most important person in his life, a woman who'd sacrificed her comfortable retirement to raise him with love and dignity despite their financial limitations. The idea that these privileged bullies would mock her honest work and dedication filled Marcus with a cold rage that he'd never experienced before. But even then, Marcus had maintained his restraint. He'd documented the new attacks, gathered additional evidence of their harassment campaign, and continued his investigation into their personal lives. He'd discovered even more damaging information about each of them, including evidence of academic cheating, illegal drug use, underage, drinking, and various violations of school policies that could result in serious consequences if properly reported. Marcus had also been in contact with his deceased father's brother, Uncle James, who lived 3 states away and worked as a federal investigator for the Treasury Department. James Thompson had been quietly providing his nephew with advice about documentation techniques, legal procedures, and the proper channels for reporting harassment and intimidation. James had also been conducting his own background checks on the families involved, using his professional resources to uncover information that wasn't available through normal channels. The intelligence that Marcus had gathered painted a picture of 4 families whose public success masked serious private problems and whose children had been allowed to develop into entitled bullies because their parents were too distracted by their own issues to provide proper guidance and discipline. Marcus had come to understand that Jake, Ryan, Connor, and Derek weren't just cruel teenagers. They were products of a privileged environment that had taught them that their actions didn't have consequences as long as they maintained their social connections and avoided obvious legal violations. This understanding had given Marcus a clear strategic advantage. He knew exactly what each of his tormentors feared most, what secrets they were desperate to keep hidden, and what leverage could be applied to force them to change their behavior. He'd developed detailed plans for applying pressure to each of them individually and collectively, using their own tactics of psychological warfare, but with far greater precision and devastating effectiveness. But Marcus had also been hoping that they would eventually cross a line so obvious and public that he could justify unleashing everything he'd prepared. He needed them to make a mistake that was witnessed by enough people to provide him with moral justification for his retaliation, something that would make his response seem proportionate rather than excessive. The morning of the cafeteria incident had started like any other Tuesday. Marcus had arrived at school early to avoid the crowds and settled into his usual corner table with his lunch and his book. He'd been reading quietly, trying to ignore the typical chaos of hundreds of teenagers eating and socializing in the large, noisy space. He'd noticed Jake's group entering the cafeteria and taking their usual table near the center of the room, but he'd kept his attention focused on his novel, hoping to remain invisible until the lunch period ended. What Marcus hadn't anticipated was that Jake's group had spent their previous class period planning something special for him. Ryan had suggested that their harassment campaign needed a dramatic escalation to push Marcus toward the breaking point they'd been working to achieve. Connor had proposed a public humiliation that would demonstrate their power while entertaining the other students who'd been watching their systematic campaign against the quiet kid. Derek had provided the strategic planning, ensuring that their actions would occur in a location with maximum visibility but minimum authority figure supervision. Jake had embraced the plan enthusiastically, viewing it as an opportunity to cement their social dominance while sending a clear message to anyone else who might be tempted to challenge their group's position in the school hierarchy. The attack had been swift and devastating. Jake had approached Marcus's table carrying a full tray of food, ostensibly heading toward the disposal area. At the perfect moment, with dozens of students watching, Jake had tripped over an imaginary obstacle, sending his entire lunch directly onto Marcus and his belongings. The mashed potatoes, meat, vegetables, and chocolate milk had covered Marcus's clothes, his backpack, his book, and his remaining sandwich. The cafeteria had erupted in laughter as Marcus sat there dripping with food, his glasses covered in gravy, his dignity completely shattered in front of hundreds of his classmates. Connor had immediately begun making jokes about Marcus's new fashion statement, while Ryan had started a slow clap that encouraged other students to join in the humiliation. Derek had pulled out his phone to record Marcus's reaction, ensuring that the moment would be preserved and could be shared on social media to extend the embarrassment beyond the immediate audience. Jake had offered a completely insincere apology, claiming that his stumble was accidental, while his smirk made it clear to everyone present that the incident had been entirely intentional. He'd even offered to help clean up the mess, a gesture that was obviously designed to further humiliate Marcus by forcing him to accept assistance from his tormentor. For several long seconds, Marcus had sat perfectly still while food dripped from his hair and clothes onto the floor around his table. The entire cafeteria had fallen silent, waiting to see how the quiet kid would respond to this ultimate humiliation. Some students had pulled out their phones to record what they assumed would be either a complete breakdown or a pathetic attempt to clean himself up while trying to preserve what little dignity he had left. But Marcus didn't break down. He didn't cry or run away or lose control of his emotions. Instead, he'd slowly removed his glasses, carefully cleaned them with a napkin, and looked directly at Jake Sullivan with an expression that was perfectly calm, but somehow deeply unsettling. For just a moment, something had flickered behind Marcus's eyes that suggested depths of intelligence and determination that his classmates had never suspected. Then Marcus had stood up, gathered his ruined belongings with quiet dignity, and walked out of the cafeteria without saying a single word. He'd left behind a room full of students who weren't quite sure what they'd just witnessed, but many of whom felt somehow uncomfortable about what they'd participated in or failed to prevent. Jake's group had celebrated their success, viewing Marcus's silent departure as evidence that they'd finally broken their target's spirit completely. They'd assumed that the public humiliation would be the final step in driving Marcus out of their school, or at least reducing him to a state of complete social invisibility where he would never again pose even the slightest challenge to their dominance. What they didn't know was that Marcus Thompson had just been given exactly what he'd been waiting for, a public incident with dozens of witnesses that provided him with complete moral justification for everything he was about to unleash upon them. The quiet kid they'd been tormenting for months was about to become their worst nightmare, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming. As Marcus walked out of that cafeteria with food still dripping from his clothes, he was already mentally reviewing the files he'd compiled on each of his tormentors and the detailed plans he'd developed for their destruction. Jake Sullivan, Ryan Martinez, Connor Williams, and Derek Chang had just made the biggest mistake of their lives, and Marcus Thompson was going to make sure they understood exactly how big that mistake had been. The transformation was about to begin, and by the end of the week, the quiet kid would own them completely. The following Monday morning arrived with an unusual tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Lincoln High School. Marcus Thompson walked through the main entrance wearing a fresh outfit, his glasses spotless, and carrying himself with a confidence that students had never witnessed before. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Where once he had moved through the hallways like a shadow trying to avoid notice, he now walked with purpose and an almost predatory awareness of his surroundings. Jake Sullivan and his crew were already gathered at their usual spot near the main staircase, basking in the aftermath of their cafeteria triumph from the previous week. They'd spent the weekend sharing videos of Marcus's humiliation on social media, ensuring that their dominance was reinforced across every platform where Lincoln High students congregated. The footage had gone viral within their school community, generating hundreds of likes, comments, and shares that seemed to validate their position at the top of the social hierarchy. Ryan Martinez was particularly pleased with the psychological impact of their attack. He'd observed several other potential targets walking with their heads down even lower than usual, clearly understanding that if Marcus Thompson could be humiliated so publicly and completely, none of them were safe from similar treatment. The message had been received exactly as intended. Submission was the only acceptable response to their authority. Connor Williams had spent his weekend fielding congratulations from other students who viewed the cafeteria incident as entertainment rather than cruelty. His natural charisma had allowed him to frame the food throwing as a harmless prank that had simply gotten out of hand, deflecting any criticism while maintaining his reputation as someone who was fun to be around rather than genuinely malicious. Derek Chang had been analyzing the social media metrics and planning their next moves. The success of their public humiliation strategy suggested that they could escalate their campaigns against other targets without fear of meaningful consequences. His parents had even complimented him on his growing popularity at school, mistaking his cruel behavior for legitimate social leadership. What none of them noticed was that Marcus Thompson was watching them with the same intensity that a scientist might observe laboratory specimens. His weekend had been spent putting the finishing touches on plans that he'd been developing for months, plans that were about to transform their comfortable world into something far more challenging and unforgiving than they could possibly imagine. Marcus's first move came during second period chemistry class, where Derek Chang was struggling to maintain his position as one of the top students in their graduating class. Derek had always relied on his natural intelligence and his parents' high expectations to motivate his academic performance, but the pressure was beginning to show as college applications approached and his social activities took up more of his time and energy. As the teacher, Mrs. Henderson, handed back their latest exam, Derek felt confident about his performance. He'd studied extensively and felt certain that he'd maintained his usual high grade. But when he looked at his paper, he found a score that made no sense. Instead of his expected A, he was looking at a C- with red marks throughout his work, indicating errors that he was certain he hadn't made. Derek immediately raised his hand to question the grading, but Mrs. Henderson seemed oddly distant and uninterested in his concerns. She suggested that perhaps Derek was overconfident about his abilities and should consider spending more time studying rather than socializing. The dismissive response was completely unlike her usual supportive attitude toward her top students, leaving Derek confused and frustrated. What Derek didn't know was that Marcus had spent his weekend learning everything he could about the school's computer systems and grading software. Using techniques he'd mastered through months of careful study, Marcus had gained access to the digital gradebook and made subtle alterations to Derek's scores across multiple subjects. The changes weren't dramatic enough to trigger automatic reviews, but they were sufficient to damage Derek's GPA and create doubt about his academic abilities. Marcus had also planted evidence suggesting that Derek had been accessing other students, worked through unauthorized means. Fake login records showed Derek's student ID being used to view assignments and exams from multiple classes, creating a pattern that looked like systematic academic dishonesty. The evidence was sophisticated enough to withstand casual investigation while being devastating enough to destroy Derek's reputation if it came to light. But the academic sabotage was just the beginning. Marcus had also discovered Derek's private social media accounts, where he'd been posting content that revealed his true attitudes toward his classmates and teachers. Using his hacking skills, Marcus had begun sharing these private posts from anonymous accounts, ensuring that Derek's cruel comments about other students and his disrespectful remarks about faculty members began circulating throughout the school community. The social media exposure was carefully timed to create maximum impact. Posts that Derek had made mocking scholarship students began appearing on platforms where those same students would see them. Comments where he'd bragged about cheating on assignments were shared with teachers who'd previously trusted his integrity. Private messages where he'd made disparaging remarks about his parents' immigrant background were forwarded to students from similar families who'd previously respected him. Derek's carefully constructed image as a studious and respectful student began crumbling as evidence of his true character spread through the school community. Teachers who'd written recommendation letters for his college applications started questioning their assessments. Students who'd viewed him as a positive role model began avoiding him in hallways and excluding him from social groups. The psychological pressure was immediate and intense. Derek found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering who had access to his private communications and what other embarrassing content might surface next. His confidence evaporated as he realized that someone was systematically dismantling everything he'd worked to build over his 4 years at Lincoln High. Meanwhile, Connor Williams was experiencing his own series of unfortunate events that seemed unrelated to Derek's problems, but were equally devastating to his social standing and personal security. Connor's role in their group had always been to provide humor and social lubrication, making him popular among students who might otherwise disapprove of Jake's more obvious bullying behavior. Connor's destruction began with the exposure of his family's financial problems, information that Marcus had gathered through careful investigation of public records and social media monitoring. Anonymous tips to the school's financial aid office revealed that Connor's family had been providing false information about their income and assets to qualify for various assistance programs, despite his father's substantial corporate salary. The financial fraud investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Connor found himself called to the principal's office to answer questions about his family's application for free lunch programs, reduced activity fees, and scholarship assistance that they weren't legally entitled to receive. The embarrassment of being exposed as someone whose family had been essentially stealing from programs designed to help genuinely needy students was devastating to Connor's reputation. Marcus had also uncovered evidence of Connor's father's gambling, addiction, and the family's mounting debts to various creditors and loan sharks. Using his technical skills, Marcus arranged for this information to reach the parents of Connor's closest friends, ensuring that Connor would be gradually excluded from social activities as families became uncomfortable with the association. The social isolation accelerated when Marcus exposed Connor's own behavior outside of school. Hidden camera footage that Marcus had somehow obtained showed Connor and his friends engaging in underage drinking, vandalism of public property, and harassment of homeless individuals in the downtown area. The footage was edited professionally and shared through anonymous social media accounts that made it impossible to trace back to Marcus. Connor's parents were contacted by police officers investigating the vandalism incidents, by school administrators concerned about the drinking footage, and by community leaders who'd seen the videos of harassment toward vulnerable populations. The combination of legal, academic, and social consequences created a crisis that consumed all of Connor's time and energy, leaving him unable to participate in the harassment campaigns that had previously defined his social identity. The psychological impact on Connor was particularly severe because his entire self-image was built around being likable and socially successful. As his reputation crumbled and his friend groups disbanded, Connor found himself experiencing social isolation for the first time in his life. The confident, humorous persona that had protected him from criticism became impossible to maintain as evidence of his true character spread throughout the community. Ryan Martinez, the strategic mastermind behind many of their harassment campaigns, discovered that someone was using his own tactics against him with far greater sophistication and precision than he'd ever achieved. Ryan's downfall began with the exposure of his father's legal troubles, information that Marcus had obtained through his uncle's federal law enforcement connections and his own investigation of public court records. Anonymous tips to the state. Your bar association provided detailed evidence of David Martinez's mishandling of client funds, his failure to properly represent indigent defendants, and his use of his legal practice to facilitate questionable business deals for wealthy clients. The investigation that followed threatened not only David's law license, but also his freedom, as several of his actions appeared to cross the line from unethical into criminal behavior. The pressure on Ryan's father created immediate consequences. For Ryan himself, David Martinez was forced to liquidate assets to pay for his legal defense, including the expensive car that Ryan drove to school and the credit cards that funded his social activities. The family's financial stress created tension at home that spilled over into Ryan's academic and social performance. Marcus had also targeted Ryan's carefully constructed academic record, which relied heavily on his ability to manipulate teachers and game the educational system rather than genuine learning or intelligence. Using his access to school computers, Marcus revealed evidence of Ryan's systematic plagiarism, his use of online essay services, and his coordination of cheating networks among wealthy students who paid others to complete their assignments. The academic fraud investigation that followed was comprehensive and damaging. Ryan found himself facing potential expulsion just months before graduation, with colleges that had already accepted him reconsidering their decisions based on his compromised academic integrity. The stress of defending himself against multiple accusations while watching his father face similar scrutiny created psychological pressure that completely undermined his ability to function as the strategic leader of their harassment campaigns. But Marcus saved his most devastating attack. For Ryan's personal psychology, through social media monitoring and digital surveillance, Marcus had discovered Ryan's deepest insecurities about his identity and his place in their affluent community. Ryan's private communications revealed someone who was deeply concerned about living up to his father's expectations, terrified of being exposed as less intelligent than he appeared, and consumed with anxiety about maintaining his social status. Marcus used this psychological intelligence to craft a campaign of subtle intimidation that played directly on Ryan's fears and insecurities. Anonymous messages suggested that people were questioning his intelligence and his contributions to their friend group. Fake social media accounts spread rumors that other students were laughing at his attempts to appear sophisticated and mature. Evidence was planted suggesting that his closest friends were secretly mocking his insecurities and planning to abandon him once they graduated. The psychological warfare was so precisely targeted that Ryan began experiencing genuine paranoia and social anxiety. He started questioning every interaction, analyzing every comment for hidden meanings, and withdrawing from the social activities that had previously given him confidence and purpose. The strategic mind that had once planned harassment campaigns became consumed with defending against attacks that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Jake Sullivan, the undisputed leader of their group, watched his carefully constructed empire crumble around him as his closest allies faced personal crises that left them unable to maintain their usual level of social dominance. Jake's own destruction was the most public and dramatic, designed to send a clear message to anyone who might consider following in his footsteps. Marcus's campaign against Jake began with the exposure of his family's construction business and the serious legal and financial problems that threatened to destroy everything the Sullivan family had built over decades. Anonymous tips to building inspectors, tax authorities, and regulatory agencies provided evidence of safety violations, tax evasion, fraudulent billing practices, and the use of undocumented workers in conditions that violated multiple labor laws. The investigation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Construction sites were shut down for safety violations, contracts were cancelled due to integrity concerns, and lawsuits from injured workers and dissatisfied customers began mounting at an alarming rate. Jake's father found himself facing potential criminal charges while watching his business empire collapse under the weight of regulatory scrutiny and negative publicity. The financial pressure on the Sullivan family was immediate and severe. The expensive lifestyle that had defined Jake's identity became impossible to maintain as legal fees consumed their savings and lost contracts eliminated their income. Jake found himself driving an old pickup truck instead of his luxury sports car, shopping at discount stores instead of expensive boutiques, and facing the possibility that his family might lose their prestigious home. But the financial consequences were nothing compared to the social destruction that Marcus orchestrated for Jake personally. Years of careful investigation had revealed that Jake's confident, charismatic persona masked deep insecurities about his athletic abilities, his intelligence, and his worthiness of the success and attention he'd received throughout his life. Marcus used this psychological intelligence to systematically destroy Jake's reputation and self-image. Hidden camera footage somehow captured Jake's private moments of vulnerability, showing him practicing speeches in mirrors, rehearsing social interactions, and expressing self-doubt in ways that completely contradicted his public image. The footage was edited and shared anonymously, revealing Jake as someone who was insecure and manipulative rather than naturally confident and charismatic. The revelation was devastating because it undermined the fundamental basis of Jake's social power. Students who had followed him out of admiration began questioning whether his leadership was genuine or simply a carefully constructed performance. Teachers who had praised his maturity and character development started recognizing manipulative behavior they'd previously missed. Even his teammates on the football team began treating him differently as they realized how much of his persona had been artificial. Marcus also exposed Jake's private communications with college recruiters, revealing conversations where Jake had made disparaging comments about his teammates, exaggerated his own contributions to the team's success, and expressed attitudes that contradicted the humble, team-first image he projected publicly. The exposure destroyed his relationships with college coaches and eliminated his prospects for athletic scholarships. The psychological pressure intensified when Marcus revealed evidence of Jake's systematic bullying campaigns against multiple students over several years. Detailed documentation showed patterns of harassment, intimidation, and social manipulation that went far beyond typical teenage social dynamics. The evidence was presented in a professional format that made it impossible to dismiss as harmless pranks or normal social competition. Parents of Jake's victims began demanding investigations and accountability. School administrators, who had previously overlooked his behavior due to his family's influence, found themselves forced to take action as the evidence became undeniable. Community leaders who had praised Jake as a positive role model began distancing themselves from someone whose true character had been so thoroughly exposed. The culmination of Marcus's revenge came during lunch period on Friday, exactly 1 week after the cafeteria incident that had triggered his retaliation. Jake, Ryan, Connor, and Derek found themselves sitting together at their usual table, but the dynamic between them had completely changed. The confidence and camaraderie that had once defined their relationships had been replaced by suspicion, anxiety, and barely concealed panic, as each of them struggled with personal crises that seemed to be spiraling beyond their control. Marcus approached their table with the same quiet confidence he displayed all week, but now his presence commanded attention rather than being ignored. Students throughout the cafeteria stopped their conversations to watch what would happen, sensing that something significant was about to occur. Standing directly in front of Jake, Marcus spoke in a voice that was calm but carried clearly throughout the room. He didn't raise his voice or display any emotion, but his words cut through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. "I want you to understand something very clearly," Marcus said, looking directly at each of them in turn. "Everything that's happened to you this week is just the beginning. I have evidence of every cruel thing you've done to me and to other students. I have documentation of your academic fraud, your illegal activities, your family's business problems, and your private communications that reveal who you really are behind your public masks." Jake tried to interrupt, but Marcus continued without acknowledging the attempted interruption. "You're going to apologize publicly to every student you've harassed. You're going to make restitution for any financial harm you've caused. You're going to submit to counseling and community service, and you're going to spend the rest of your time at this school making amends for the damage you've done to other people's lives." Ryan attempted to argue, claiming that Marcus couldn't prove anything and that their families would protect them from consequences. Marcus smiled for the first time, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Your father's law license hearing is scheduled for next month. Connor's family is facing fraud charges. Derek's academic record is under investigation by every college that accepted him, and Jake's football scholarship has been withdrawn due to character concerns." The color drained from each of their faces as they realized that Marcus wasn't bluffing. Everything he'd described was actually happening, and their attempts to use family influence to avoid consequences had been systematically undermined by someone who understood their weaknesses better than they understood themselves. Marcus placed a manila envelope on their table. "Inside this envelope are copies of all the evidence I've compiled about your activities. You have 48 hours to begin implementing the changes I've outlined. If you choose not to comply, the remaining evidence will be shared with law enforcement, college admissions offices, and every social media platform where your victims and their families can see exactly what kind of people you really are." The silence in the cafeteria was absolute. Hundreds of students watched as the four most powerful bullies in their school sat frozen with fear, while the quiet kid they tormented delivered an ultimatum that left them no options except complete surrender. Connor broke first, his usual humor completely absent as he whispered, "What do you want us to do?" Marcus's response was measured and precise. "You're going to experience exactly what you put other people through. Social isolation, public humiliation, academic pressure, and constant uncertainty about what consequences might come next. The only difference is that you deserve everything that's happening to you." Derek tried to negotiate, offering to make private apologies and promising to leave Marcus alone in the future. But Marcus shook his head, explaining that private solutions weren't sufficient for public problems. Their harassment campaigns had been systematic and public, so their accountability needed to be equally systematic and public. Ryan made one last attempt to assert their former authority, threatening to report Marcus for harassment and intimidation, but Marcus was prepared for this response. He calmly explained that every action he'd taken was either completely legal or virtually impossible to trace back to him. He'd used their own tactics of anonymity and plausible deniability, but with far greater skill and precision than they'd ever achieved. Jake, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke in a voice that was barely audible. "How long have you been planning this?" Marcus considered the question for a moment before answering. "I've been documenting your behavior since the second week of school. I've been investigating your families and your private lives since the first month. I've been preparing for this moment since you decided that humiliating me publicly was acceptable behavior." The admission sent a chill through everyone present as they realized that Marcus Thompson had been playing a completely different game than anyone had understood. While his tormentors had been focused on immediate gratification and social entertainment, Marcus had been conducting a comprehensive intelligence operation that left them completely vulnerable to retribution. As Marcus walked away from their table, leaving the envelope behind, the four former bullies understood that their positions at the top of Lincoln High's social hierarchy had been permanently destroyed. The quiet kid they'd thought was weak and defenseless had proven to be the most dangerous opponent they could have chosen. Someone who combined intelligence, patience, and ruthless determination in ways that made their crude intimidation tactics seem primitive by comparison. The transformation was complete. Marcus Thompson had not only defended himself successfully, but had established a new order where harassment and bullying would no longer be tolerated. The ripple effects of his victory would protect countless future students from the kind of systematic cruelty that Jake's group had perfected over years of unchallenged dominance. The lesson was clear and undeniable. True power came not from family connections or social status, but from intelligence, preparation, and the moral courage to stand up for what was right. Marcus had proven that even the most powerless victims could become formidable opponents when they refused to accept injustice and chose to fight back with everything they had. The quiet kid had made them beg, and everyone who witnessed it understood that Lincoln High School would never be the same again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.